Chapter 8. Hold people accountable, but don't hold their hands. Jocko Willink. Baghdad, Iraq, 2003. Ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba. The M250 caliber machine gun, which we affectionately called the Ma Deuce, was unleashing fury into the city. And it wasn't alone in its firepower. Our convoy of Humvees had taken some enemy small arms fire from a building near the highway on which we were driving. We were in Baghdad, and it was the fall of 2003, early in the Iraq War. Our Humvees were unarmored. We had completely removed the canvas vehicle doors and modified the seats to face outward so that we could scan with our weapons and engage threats. Facing outward also presented our body armor plates toward potential enemy contact to protect us from the impact of enemy bullets. The Ma Deuce 50 cal was mounted in the turret, the circular hole in the top of each Humvee manned by a SEAL who stood with his chest and head protruding through the roof. Each Humvee carried SEAL assaulters in the back on bench seats, with medium machine guns mounted on articulating swing arms so we could shoot accurately on the move. As soon as the shooting started, a call came out over the radio. "Contact right." That let everyone know that the enemy attack was to our right. Immediately, everyone who could get their weapon into position returned fire with a vengeance. Dozens of machine guns belched flames and tracer fire along with M4 rifles. We laid down an overwhelming barrage of firepower that likely compelled whomever had engaged us to deeply regret that decision. But just because we were shooting didn't mean we stopped the convoy or even slowed down. As we fired, the call came quickly over the radio, blow through, which meant we would actually increase speed to get out of the ambush area. And that was exactly what we did. Within a few hundred yards, we were clear of the ambush, and the call to stop shooting came over the radio. "Cease fire." We continued on, back to our base on the outskirts of Baghdad International Airport. Upon arrival, we fueled up the Humvees in preparation for the next mission and headed back to our compound for the debrief. The debrief wasn't critical. Why would it be? We had made it through another attempted enemy ambush, and once again, we crushed them, and they didn't hit any of us. In the early days of the Iraq War, we weren't yet facing the well-organized, combat-experienced, and well-funded insurgency that Task Unit Bruiser would come up against in Ramadi 3 years later. At this time, the enemy consisted of little more than criminals, thugs, and former Saddam Hussein regime elements running around trying to cause problems. They weren't much of a problem for us. We were well-trained. We were aggressive. And we were executing missions that gave us a solid advantage over the enemy. Most of the operations we conducted were what we called direct action missions, with the objective of capturing or killing the suspected bad guys for planning and executing attacks against U.S. forces, Iraqi security forces, or the new interim government of Iraq. We would gather intelligence, bounce what we knew off of various other intelligence sources, trying to confirm the most important piece of information about the suspected terrorists, their location. Once we had their location, we planned our assault. The assaults were fairly straightforward. We would stop the vehicles at a pre-designated location and patrol on foot to the target. Once at the target, we used various means to enter the outer walled compound, sometimes going over the walls, sometimes breaching the gates, sometimes both simultaneously. Within a few minutes, we had the entire target building under our control and had subdued all possible threats. Of course, the planning for every mission was slightly different based on the specific target. We adapted our plans and the tactics, techniques, and procedures to execute operations, but at the same time, we always maintained a solid grip on the fundamental principles of combat leadership: cover and move, simple, prioritize and execute, and decentralized command. Cover and move allowed us to maneuver safely to and from the target. We used this basic but essential tactic for every movement, and it was present in every plan we developed. We kept the plan simple. While it was sometimes tempting to use more complex or convoluted tactics, we always chose the most straightforward course of action so that everyone on the team knew exactly how to execute the plan. During the planning phase, we would utilize prioritize and execute to ensure the team concentrated our efforts on the most important facets of the target, and we would focus our resources there. Lastly, we would create our plans with decentralized command. The junior leaders developed supporting sections, then we would consolidate these into one comprehensive plan. On top of the laws of combat, we used stealth, surprise, and violence of action to ensure we had the upper hand on the enemy whenever possible. It was never our intent to have a fair fight. It was our job to maximize our advantages over the enemy, and we did everything in our power to make this happen. Our tactics and planning usually left the enemy shaken, confused, and unable to intelligently defend themselves. Since no one in my platoon had been in combat before, the opportunity to exercise everything we had learned about planning and executing operations was gratifying. Not only because we were carrying out important missions, but also because we had trained and prepared for so long. It was awesome. It was awesome because we were getting to do real work after the long, dry years of no combat. It was awesome because we had developed sound tactics that made us highly effective. It was awesome because we dominated the enemy. Our weapons, tactics, and training were far superior. We felt like rock stars. During the few firefights we found ourselves in, they didn't stand a chance. So far, only one man had been wounded, and it was relatively minor. We felt unstoppable. That felt good. The more missions we handled, the more confident we became. We began to try to push even harder, to complete our missions even faster, to push the envelope. I noticed that guys started carrying less gear so they could move faster, fewer magazines of ammunition, since we hadn't been in any sustained contacts, fewer hand grenades, since we hadn't had to use them as the enemy didn't put up much resistance. They began to carry less water since the missions were quick, and we always had vehicles nearby with ample supplies of water in big 5-gallon jugs. This was all done in the belief that if we were lighter, we could move more quickly. We could bound in and out of doors and windows and more efficiently chase down bad guys who had fled from the target buildings. We wanted to be better and more effective at our jobs, and I agreed with that. But then, arrogance started to creep in. We started to think that the enemy couldn't even touch us. One day, before a mission, I talked with one of my guys. "Let's go get him," I joked with him, slapping him on the back. But instead of hitting the solid mass of the ballistic body armor plate we wore in both the front and the back, I felt only soft web gear. I grabbed the web gear and squeezed it to confirm he had no ballistic backplate inserted into his web gear. "Where's your backplate?" I asked him. "I took it out," he said. "You took it out?" I said, incredulous. "Yeah, I took it out," he said, indifferent. "It's too heavy. I can move a lot quicker without it." I was shocked. Of course, at about 7 pounds each, the plates were heavy, but they stopped bullets from entering your body and killing you. "Yeah, but what if you get shot?" I asked him. "I'm not going to be running," he said defiantly. "The enemy isn't going to shoot me in the back. A lot of us took them out," he told me with a shrug of the shoulders, as if this idea made total sense. "A lot of guys?" I asked him. "Yeah. We want to be fast," he said. Some of my guys weren't wearing body armor, a key piece of life-saving equipment. Idiots, I thought to myself. What a bunch of idiots! Then I quickly realized this was my fault. I was responsible for making sure my men had the right equipment every time they went in the field. That was why we held inspections, to make sure they were accountable. But our operational tempo was so fast that I didn't always have time to inspect everyone's gear. Of course, between me, my platoon chief, and our LPO, or leading petty officer, gear did get inspected regularly. But we sometimes launched on missions within 15 to 20 minutes of being tasked. There was no way we could inspect everyone's gear every single time. There had to be a better way than imposed accountability to make sure everyone was carrying all the gear they should be, including the ballistic backplate to help prevent them from taking a bullet to the back. I knew the answer. The solution to this problem wasn't accountability. The solution was the same answer to every problem in every team: leadership. I had to lead. A few minutes later, we were standing around the magnet board for roll call in preparation for the next mission before we loaded up the vehicles to launch. Once the LPO had gone through roll call, I said my final piece before launch. "Remember, we are trying to get off the target quickly," I said. "This is a bad area, and we don't want the enemy in the neighborhood to have time to set up on us when we leave." "And, last thing," I emphasized, "if you don't have your backplate in, go put it in, now, everyone. All right? Loading up in 5, let's go." Only about 5 or 6 guys scurried off to their tent to grab their backplate, but that was 5 or 6 too many. A few minutes later, we loaded up the Humvees and headed out on the operation. It all went smoothly. We hit the target, grabbed the bad guys, gathered the intelligence we needed, and headed back to base. During the debrief, I addressed the issue of the backplates. Not by yelling or screaming or even threatening accountability by constant inspections of everyone's gear. I knew accountability wasn't the answer. We just didn't have time to hold everyone accountable before each and every operation. Instead, I explained why it was important for them to wear their plates. "I know some of you haven't been wearing your backplate, right?" I looked around the room. A few guys nodded. "Bad idea," I continued. "Bad idea." "Why wouldn't you wear your backplate?" I questioned one of the guys. "Trying to be lighter," he said. "The lighter we are, the faster we can move." "I get that," I answered. "But can you move faster than a bullet?" That got a little chuckle from the group. "Yeah, but I'm not trying to outrun a bullet," one young, confident SEAL said. "In fact, I'm not running away, so the enemy isn't going to see my back." This also got a reaction from the group with some head nods and grins. I even heard a hell yeah from a couple guys in the back of the room. It was a bold statement, a confident statement, a courageous statement. But it crossed the line from bold, confident, and courageous into cockiness and arrogance. I understood how the young, confident SEAL had arrived at that conclusion and how anyone in the platoon might have arrived at the same thing. We had been winning against the enemy, and winning easily. We had been shot at only a couple of times and nothing very significant. We were dominating and felt untouchable. "Okay, I'm glad you aren't going to run away from the enemy. I don't think anyone in this room will," I told the group, and I truly believed this. Our platoon was solid. "But let me ask you this," I continued. "Do you always know where the enemy will be? Do you always think he is going to be in front of you? Don't you think we could get ambushed or flanked from behind and you might get shot at from that direction when you hadn't anticipated it?" The room got quiet. Of course that could happen at any time. "Listen, I'm glad we are kicking the enemy's ass," I said, "and we are going to keep kicking his ass. But we cannot get arrogant or complacent. The enemy might never get the drop on us. But at the same time, he might get the drop on you on the next mission. And while being light is good and allows us to be quick, being quick isn't going to stop a bullet from entering your back and killing you. And it isn't just about you. It isn't just you individually at risk. If one of you gets shot, that means others have to carry you. Think about how much that will slow us down in a serious gunfight when we want to be light and fast." "But it's about much more than that," I said. If one of us gets killed, it's a win for the enemy. And on top of that, more important, it's a loss for America, for the Navy, for the teams, and for your family. And we need to do everything we can to prevent that loss. That includes wearing all the ballistic protection we can get. Understood? The room was quiet. I had made my point. As the deployment continued, we still didn't have time to inspect everyone's gear. But we made it a point to make sure everyone understood the bare minimum they needed to carry. They also understood what items were not optional, and, more important, why they were not optional. Once my troops understood why a piece of life-saving equipment was needed and how it impacted not only them, but the mission as well, they made sure not only to have the proper gear with them, but also that the gear was ready for use. This didn't happen because I held them accountable. It happened because they now understood why the particular piece of gear was important for them, for the mission, and for the team. Now, they were holding themselves accountable. Furthermore, when the troops understood why, they are empowered, and with that empowerment, they began to police themselves and each other, which provides redundancy and unification of effort. This is not to say that I never inspected gear. That is the dichotomy. While the leader wants team members to police themselves because they understand why, the leader still has to hold people accountable through some level of inspection to ensure that the why is not only understood, but being acted upon. So, my platoon chief, LPO, or I would still regularly inspect gear when able. But that was not our primary tool for accountability. We didn't need to hold the troops' hands to make sure they were accountable. They held themselves accountable, which proved far more effective. Once the platoon realized the importance of executing in accordance with the standard and how violating the required gear list impacted the overall mission, we didn't have to rely solely on gear inspections. Each team member applied peer pressure to keep others in check. And that peer pressure from within the team was far more powerful than any pressure I could apply from above them in the chain of command. The balance between the troops understanding the why mixed with intrusive accountability provides the best possible outcome for a team. As a testament, through the rest of the deployment, I never caught another man without body armor again. Principle. Accountability is an important tool that leaders must utilize. However, it should not be the primary tool. It must be balanced with other leadership tools, such as making sure people understand the why, empowering subordinates, and trusting they will do the right thing without direct oversight because they fully understand the importance of doing so. Unfortunately, leaders often get the idea that accountability can solve everything. And in a sense, they are right. If a leader wants to ensure a subordinate follows through with a task, the leader can inspect repeatedly to confirm that the task gets done. With enough oversight, task completion can achieve 100% success. This is why leaders often want to use accountability to fix problems. It is the most obvious and simple method. The leader tells a subordinate to carry out a task. The leader watches the subordinate do the task. The leader inspects the task once it is complete. There is almost no room for error. Unfortunately, there is also almost no room for the leader to do anything else besides monitor the progress of that specific subordinate in that specific task. If there are multiple subordinates with multiple tasks, the leader very quickly becomes physically incapable of inspecting them all. On top of that, while focused down the chain of command and inward toward the team, the leader will have no ability to look up and out, up towards senior leadership to build relationships and influence strategic decisions, and out toward the strategic mission to anticipate future operations and understand developments. Finally, when the leader is not present to provide immediate oversight, the subordinate may or may not continue to properly execute a particular task. Instead of using accountability as the primary tool of leadership, leaders should implement it as just one of the many leadership tools. Instead of holding people accountable, the leader has to lead. The leader must make sure the team understands why. Make sure its members have ownership of their tasks and the ability to make adjustments as needed. Make sure they know how their task supports the overall strategic success of the mission. Make sure they know how important their specific task is to the team and what the consequences are for failure. Now, this does not mean that accountability should never be used. In Extreme Ownership, Chapter 2, No Bad Teams, Only Bad Leaders, we wrote that when it comes to standards, as a leader, it's not what you preach, it's what you tolerate. It is imperative that leaders hold the line and uphold the standards where it matters most. That is another dichotomy, nested in accountability. There are absolutely cases when accountability should and must be used. If a subordinate is not performing to standard, despite understanding why, despite knowing the impact on the mission, and despite being given ownership, then a leader must hold the line. That method is accountability. The leader must drill down and micromanage tasks in order to get the subordinate on track. But the leader cannot stay there. The leader must eventually give subordinates leeway to perform based on their own intrinsic drive, not because they're being held accountable, and not based on the micromanagement of the leader, but because they have a better understanding of why. And that is where balance must be found. Use accountability as a tool when needed, but don't rely on it as the sole means of enforcement. A reliance on heavy accountability consumes the time and focus of the leader and inhibits the trust, growth, and development of subordinates. Instead, balance accountability with educating the team and empowering its members to maintain standards even without direct oversight from the top. This is the hallmark of the highest performing teams that dominate. Application to business. They just won't do what we tell them to do, the national operations manager told me. They just don't seem to care. The company had started using a new software program about 3 months earlier to track their product as it was installed and utilized by the customers, which consisted of medium to large-sized businesses. It was a well-thought-out system built on an existing platform that allowed technicians in the field to input what equipment had been installed, the tests that were completed, issues overcome, and shortfalls of the system. It also interacted with the company's customer relationship management system, providing salespeople with information about the customers if they needed to approach them about renewal or upgrades. What exactly is it the field technicians won't do? I asked. They won't use the system. They won't enter the information. They show up on site with a customer to take care of an install or a troubleshooting scenario. They do their work, then boom, that's it. They enter the bare minimum into the system, but no details. What details should they be entering? I asked. The details are critical, not for them, but for the follow-on, the ops manager said. If something else goes wrong and another technician has to go out and troubleshoot, it saves a lot of time and effort if they know what the previous technician did. On top of that, the details really help our salespeople. When they call to offer new services or a renewal of existing services, if they don't know what the customer has been through, they might get blindsided. It makes it seem as if no one at the company cares about the customer at all. Try selling to someone that already thinks your company doesn't care about them. I can see where that would be problematic, I acknowledged. So what have you done to get them to do what they are supposed to do? We put a whole bunch of accountability checks in place, he said. We started with the technicians themselves. We told them they need to fill in the details. That barely had any impact. Next, we went to the team leaders. We told them we wanted entries in every field of the software. and that we would give out bonuses based on the number of fields filled out. And how did that work, I asked. It cost us money, but it didn't get us anywhere, the ops manager replied. The technicians did as they were told. They filled out every field, but they did so with worthless 1- and 2-word answers. Ouch, I said. Yeah, ouch, the ops manager agreed. Next up were the regional operations managers. We figured if we held them accountable, they would make it happen. So we told them if the technicians in their regions didn't start filling out all the fields with legitimate details, we were going to drop their volume bonuses by 10%. We saw a little uptick after that for about 2 weeks. Then things went backward. Back to where technicians weren't filling out anything at all, not even a word in most of the fields. Not good, I commented. No, not good at all, the ops manager said. Especially because we reached pretty deep into our budget to have this new software designed, built, and implemented. All right, I declared. Let me go and talk to some of the team leaders, regional managers, and frontline technicians and see what I can figure out. Over the next few days, I set meetings and went around talking to everyone involved down the chain of command. I started with the regional managers. It didn't take long to figure out what was going on with them. They had tried to hold the team leaders and technicians accountable for filling in every field, especially when their volume bonus was threatened with a 10% cut. But it didn't take them long to figure out that if their technicians spent the additional time filling in all the fields, they couldn't cover as many installations or customer service calls. By not covering as many installations, they made less money, and that cost them more than the 10% penalty for non-compliance with the software. Once they realized this, the regional managers backed off holding the front line accountable. The team leaders had another story. They were busy. They handled the schedules for their teams, and it was a huge job. Appointments, cancellations, customers not present, jobs taking too long and interfering with other jobs, and of course, dealing with absent technicians and getting their jobs covered. On top of that, as the technical experts, they spent a fair amount of time on the phone with technicians troubleshooting more complex problems. Finally, they were also the first point of impact for customer complaints. Any issue with the product or the technician came directly to the team leader first, and those calls had to be handled delicately and tactfully. With all of this on their plates, they didn't have time for much else. And they certainly didn't have time to load individual technicians' screens after every call to ensure that the data was being entered. So even though they understood that it needed to happen, they simply didn't have the time to execute it. Finally, I got into the field and talked to some of the technicians. They had some significant problems. First of all, entering the information into the system took longer than the senior leaders knew. In the field, different customers in different areas had varying levels of cell phone reception. In areas with poor signals, loading each page could take a minute or two, and there were 8 pages to load, so this was a huge waste of time. Furthermore, each page started with the need to re-enter the customer's name, address, and account number. Copy and paste wasn't a solution because you couldn't copy more than one field at a time, requiring you to flip back and forth between screens, which took forever. Last, instead of having some multiple choice options for the most common answers, every answer had to be typed in, which wasted even more time. On top of all that, and most important, no one on the front lines really understood how the data was going to help them. When I reported back to the National Operations Manager with all this information, he was shocked. "Okay," he said in a depressed voice. "Accountability didn't work. Now what?" "Now, you lead," I told him. He took a moment to let that sink in. Finally, he broke. "Well then, I am at a loss. How am I supposed to lead here?" It was a great sign. He was humble enough to admit he needed some help. And, what's more, humble enough to ask for it. "Okay, it isn't that bad," I replied. "Luckily, you have a bunch of good people out there who want to do the right thing. First, you've got to solicit input on how to make the software better. There are some things that would really simplify it. Multiple choice answers for one. Making the customer information flow from one screen onto the next would be helpful. These guys are typing the same information on every page. And there should be fewer pages. Simplify. I know you rarely have to print these things out, so why do they need to be compatible with a paper format? Put more questions on each screen so the texts aren't loading screen after screen. That wastes all kinds of time in the field. Those are just some of the initial suggestions after talking to only 4 or 5 of your techs. I'm sure a broader inquiry would yield even more ideas to streamline the software based on direct feedback from the guys who use it. That makes sense, the ops manager replied. I thought we had gotten enough feedback. Maybe you did in the beginning, I said. But once a complex thing like this hits the field, you need to continually get feedback to make it better. That's just the way it is. Got it. Anything else? The ops manager asked. Absolutely, I said. The biggest thing I figured out in talking to the frontline troops about this is that they have no idea why they are doing this. And, most important, how it affects them. How it affects them, he repeated. Yes, right now, they don't get it, I said. But they know this data will help us hold on to customers and allow us to upsell them on better, more expensive products, the ops manager said. Obviously, that is going to make the company more profitable. What else is there to get? Okay, think about what you just said, I stated. If the company makes more money, if the company is more profitable, do you think that a frontline technician cares? I hope he cares. It's his paycheck, the ops manager yelled. Hope isn't a course of action, I said. And, from his perspective, he's been getting a paycheck consistently for as long as he's been employed here, regardless of how profitable the company is or isn't. It simply doesn't impact him. He should still care about it, the ops manager insisted. Of course he should, I agreed. And in a perfect world, every employee would care deeply about the profitability of the company he or she works for. But these folks have other things to care about. Husbands and wives, kids, soccer games, bills and cars and mortgages and the game on Friday night and the broken water heater and the kid heading off to college. They have a ton to care about, and like it or not, the profitability of the company is not high on their list. So then what do we do? The ops manager asked. If they don't care, why should they give any extra effort? They have to understand why. But that why has to have a thread that ties back to them, to what's in it for them, I told him. How do you do that? He asked. How can I make them care about the company's profits? You have to think it through, I said. It's like this. If you can capture this data that you want, you will be able to better arm both technicians in the field and your salespeople, right? Absolutely. That's the whole point, the ops manager agreed. And once the technicians and the salespeople are armed, they can do a better job, right? I continued. Definitely, he answered. Okay, I said. Now, follow me. Armed with this data, the technicians will be able to provide better and faster customer service, and the salespeople will be able to sell more product to more customers. When we provide better service and sell more products, our business grows. When our business grows, we make more money. That's what I said. But how does that help? The ops manager interrupted. Listen, I told him. When the company makes more money, we can invest more money in advertising and infrastructure. Once we put more money into advertising and infrastructure, we will gain even more customers and be able to support them even better. The better we perform as a company, the more customers we acquire. The more customers we acquire, the more work there is for technicians, which means overtime and overtime pay. And once the company maxes that out, we will need more technicians. The more technicians we need, the more we will have to pay them to be here. So this means down the line, we will increase pay for the technicians, especially the experienced ones. And lastly, the more technicians and clients we have, the more team leaders and regional supervisors we will need. this opens up a pathway to advancement for every technician at this company. So profitability of the company not only puts money into the pockets of the owners, which the frontline technicians probably don't care too much about, but more important, it impacts the technicians directly. It opens up opportunity for more pay, higher salaries, and a pathway for career advancement. That's the thread that ties all of this together and aligns everyone at the company, the corporate leadership team, right down to the field technicians. That's leadership. The operations manager nodded. The light had come on. It was clear. Over the next 2 days, I helped him put together a simple, clear presentation that explained the thread of why. We also talked about the fact that he would still have to occasionally inspect people's work to ensure that things were being done. There still had to be some level of overt accountability. But most of the accountability would come intrinsically from the individual leaders and the field technicians themselves, who were now empowered by understanding why. They would help keep each other accountable when they fully understood the impact and the direct benefit to them. A few days later, the National Operations Manager briefed the plan during an all-hands morning call. He also put one of the tech-savvy regional managers in charge of compiling feedback about the software system so it could be improved. Most important, he drove home how every member of the company would benefit from collecting data to the best of their ability, which would help every employee improve their lives. The troops now understood that, and they went to work.